It was a typical Tuesday morning at Peak Ventures Bank in the heart of downtown San Francisco. The city was alive, bustling with the rhythm of business and commuters streaming in and out of offices. The sound of footsteps echoed across the polished marble floors. The soft murmur of conversation blended with the faint hum of printers and phones ringing. Jaylen Harris walked into the bank at exactly 9:00 a.m. Just as the sun broke through the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the lobby. He stepped into the sleek glass doors of Peak Ventures Bank, a place that he had helped build from the ground up. As a self-made entrepreneur, Jaylen had transformed a small idea into a successful company, and this bank, his bank, was the cornerstone of his financial empire. It was his pride. It was the manifestation of everything he had worked so hard to achieve. On any other day, Jaylen would have been dressed in a tailored suit, exuding the confidence that came with his title as CEO of Harris Enterprises. But today, he was dressed simply. He wore a navy blue polo shirt, jeans, and sneakers, an unassuming choice, one that blended him in with the everyday customers who came to the bank. His purpose was simple, a routine withdrawal from his personal account. Nothing extravagant, just $10. He had always prided himself on being a customer-centric leader, someone who valued his employees and always made sure to engage with them personally. Today, however, he wasn't here to run a meeting or negotiate a deal. He was here to take out money, just like anyone else. As Jaylen stepped further into the bank, he took note of the usual scene, tellers busily working, people waiting in line, and the steady click-clack of shoes echoing throughout the vast, modern space. The atmosphere felt polished, professional, and efficient. This was what Jaylen had envisioned when he started the bank. It was an extension of his values, hard work, integrity, and fairness. But today, something felt different. Jaylen's gaze moved to the counter, where a middle-aged white man was being served. The teller, a young woman named Sarah, smiled warmly at the man as she counted out stacks of cash, neatly organized, crisp bills, handing them over with no hesitation. The man received 20 dozen, a far larger sum than Jaylen had planned to withdraw. Yet, there was no scrutiny, no questions asked. The man pocketed the money and walked out without a second glance. Jaylen's chest tightened. He had seen this before, seen it in countless other establishments, heard the stories, and felt the sting of subtle discrimination, the silent bias that lingered in the air. But today, he was determined to ensure that his bank, the very institution he had poured his heart and soul into, wasn't another perpetrator of that same quiet injustice. He walked to the counter where Sarah was now serving him. She didn't greet him with a smile or any warmth. Instead, she simply slid a clipboard across the counter, barely glancing at him. Her tone was curt, detached, as if he were just another faceless customer. "Fill this out," she said flatly. Jaylen's brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He was just a man, coming to his own bank, trying to make a simple withdrawal. He took the clipboard and began to fill out the standard form, taking care to provide all the necessary information. Once done, he slid the paperwork back to her, along with his ID. Sarah barely glanced at his identification. Instead, her eyes flickered toward the withdrawal slip, her expression shifting immediately. Without hesitation, she shoved the form back across the counter. "We can't process this," she said curtly, folding her arms across her chest. Jaylen's stomach churned. He was momentarily taken aback. "Excuse me," he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah didn't flinch. "We don't handle large cash withdrawals like this." Jaylen's confusion deepened. He looked over his shoulder and saw the man who had just walked out with $20. "Dozen without any issue." "I just saw that man leave with 20,000, Jaylen said, gesturing toward the door. "You didn't hesitate with him." Sarah's lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked away. "That's different," she said, her voice now laced with irritation. Jaylen leaned in slightly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "How exactly is it different?" Sarah turned her head slightly, eyes flicking to the back office where the manager, Emma Williams, stood, arms crossed, watching the exchange with an expression that was hard to read. Jaylen followed Sarah's gaze and immediately understood. The moment Emma's eyes met his, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah's posture straightened, and Jaylen knew this wasn't just a matter of policy. This was something else. "Emma, in her early 40s, was known for her calculating demeanor. She wasn't someone who made decisions on a whim. Jaylen had met her before. An ambitious woman, sharp and quick with decisions, but something about the way she was watching the interaction now made his stomach churn. Without another word, Sarah turned on her heel and disappeared into the back office, leaving Jaylen standing at the counter. He could feel the weight of the room shifting. The tension was palpable now. Other customers glanced in his direction, some shifting uncomfortably, others pretending not to notice, but all of them aware that something was unfolding. A few moments later, Emma emerged from the back office, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She walked toward Jaylen with the cold, controlled professionalism she was known for. Behind her, Sarah followed, her eyes darting nervously between Emma and Jaylen. "Good morning, sir," Emma said, her voice smooth, but laced with an undercurrent of condescension. "I understand you're trying to make a large withdrawal today." Jaylen met her gaze evenly. Emma's smile was tight, her eyes not quite meeting his as she continued. "Unfortunately, we have certain security protocols in place for transactions of this size. For the safety of our customers and staff, we have to be extra cautious." Jaylen's patience was starting to wear thin, but he kept his tone calm. "So what does that mean for me?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. Emma's smile remained, but it no longer seemed genuine. "It means we need to verify some additional information before proceeding." Jaylen's frustration flared. "You mean my information?" "Because I watched you process a larger withdrawal for a customer just before me. No questions asked." Emma's smile remained fixed, but Jaylen could see the tension in her jaw. "I can't speak to other customers' transactions," she said coolly, her voice growing sharper. "But in your case, I'll need to confirm the source of these funds and verify your last deposit amount." Jaylen's heart began to race, the unfairness of the situation clear in his mind. "I've been a customer here for years," he said, his voice tightening, "and I've never been treated like this before." The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. As Jaylen stood at the counter, his patience wearing thin, Emma's voice remained cold, professional. Too professional. She wasn't speaking to him like a valued customer. She wasn't treating him as an equal, as a person who belonged. The weight of the situation began to settle into his chest, and for the first time, he felt the full force of it. "Do you want to know what the difference is between me and that man who took out $20,000? Jaylen asked, his voice steady, but the frustration was clear in his words. "The only difference is the color of my skin." Emma's eyes flickered for a moment. There was a brief hesitation, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. She wasn't going to back down. "Not here. Not now. I'm not sure what you're implying, sir," she said, her voice taking on that polished edge again. "But this is standard protocol. We can't process large withdrawals without confirming some details." Jaylen leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I've been banking here for years. My account's been active for over a decade. And you know what? I've never once been asked for these additional checks. Not once." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Emma faltered. The lie was clear. She knew it, he knew it, and now, the truth of the situation was hanging over them like a storm cloud. "I'm not going to play this game," Jaylen continued, his tone now taking on a sharper edge. "You're refusing to process my withdrawal because you've already decided I'm a threat. You've already decided I'm not deserving of the same service as everyone else." Emma's expression didn't change, but there was something new in her eyes, something colder. "Sir," she said slowly, "please cooperate. We have procedures in place for a reason." "Cooperate?" Jaylen's laugh was bitter. "I'm not the one who needs to cooperate here. You are. You're the one who's choosing to profile me. You're the one who's choosing to treat me like a criminal. I'm asking you to process my withdrawal, just like you did for that man." For the first time, Emma's composure slipped. She blinked a couple of times, her lips pressed tightly together. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned slightly and motioned for the security guard to approach. Jaylen's eyes narrowed as Ethan Reynolds, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Ethan's presence was imposing, and Jaylen could feel the weight of the situation shifting once again. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about power. Who had it, and who was being denied it? Jaylen had seen this before. He had watched too many times as the systems of power were used to marginalize and dismiss people like him. But today would be different. He wasn't going to be ignored. Ethan stopped beside him, his eyes scanning Jaylen before meeting Emma's gaze. The guard's stance was rigid, and there was no hesitation in his movements. The decision had already been made. The message was clear. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir, Ethan said flatly, his tone flat and impersonal. You're causing a disturbance. Jaylen's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Causing a disturbance? He asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm standing here, trying to withdraw my own money, and you're telling me I'm causing a disturbance? No, you're denying me service, and you're using your authority to intimidate me into compliance. Emma's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Jaylen saw a flash of uncertainty. It was fleeting, but it was there. She hadn't expected him to challenge her so openly, and now the cracks were beginning to show. You need to leave, sir, Ethan repeated, this time with more force behind his words. You're not welcome here. Jaylen straightened his back, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to be bullied. Not today. You don't get to decide that, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. I built this bank, and I'm not leaving until I get what I'm entitled to, my money. The room had fallen silent. The tellers, the customers, they were all watching now. They were all witnessing the power struggle unfolding before them. They had all seen this before. The subtle discrimination, the biases hidden behind false pretenses. But Jaylen wasn't going to let it slide. Not today. Ethan took another step toward him. But this time, Jaylen didn't back down. His hand slid into his pocket, and he pulled out his phone. Without breaking eye contact with Ethan, he unlocked it and tapped the record button. You're refusing to process my withdrawal, Jaylen said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the bank. Even though I've provided all the required identification, even though you processed a larger withdrawal for a white customer just moments ago, and now you're telling me I need to leave. Emma's jaw clenched. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Jaylen to fight back this fiercely. And yet, here he was, standing tall, refusing to be intimidated. You've made a mistake. Jaylen continued, his gaze never wavering. But don't worry. I'm going to make sure this mistake gets corrected. The air in the bank seemed to hold its breath. The tension palpable. Ethan Reynolds, standing beside Jaylen, shifted his stance slightly, his hand twitching near his radio. He was waiting for an order, a command, something to justify what was happening. But even he knew, deep down, that there was no justification for what was unfolding before them. This wasn't about procedures or security. This was about something far uglier. Racial profiling, power, and who controlled it. Jaylen kept his phone raised, recording the scene. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not this time. He had spent his entire life fighting against systems that sought to undermine his success. And he wasn't going to let them erase his hard-earned place in this world. Call your manager, Jaylen said to Emma, his voice low but filled with authority. You're clearly out of your depth here. Emma's expression faltered for a split second. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked unsure, her confidence shaken, but she quickly recovered, her gaze narrowing at him with a hint of frustration. I'm going to ask you one more time, she said, her voice tight. Please leave the premises. Jaylen shook his head slowly, his voice calm but unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. You're refusing service. You're refusing to process my withdrawal, and now you're trying to remove me from my own bank. He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. That's not going to happen. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. She had already made up her mind. It was clear she wasn't going to back down without a fight. But before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling up outside reached Jaylen's ears, faint but unmistakable. He knew who it was, the person who could bring everything to a halt, the one who had the power to set things right. David Carter, the chairman of Harris Enterprises, stepped into the bank. His presence was immediately felt by everyone in the room. His aura commanded attention, not because of his physical size, but because of the quiet, unwavering confidence that exuded from him. David was a man who had earned everything he had. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But today, he wasn't here to show off his power. He was here to fix a broken system. David's eyes locked onto Jaylen first, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, without acknowledging the bank employees or the security guard, he made his way to the counter. The room seemed to shrink as he walked, his every step measured, deliberate. He was a force to be reckoned with, and everyone in the room knew it. Is there a problem here? David's voice cut through the silence, sharp and to the point. Emma, who had been standing with her arms crossed, visibly stiffened. She tried to maintain her professional mask, but it was slipping. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice far less composed than before. There's no problem. We were just following standard protocol for a large withdrawal. David's eyes narrowed, his expression cool but calculating. I'm going to ask you again, he said, his tone even, but carrying an edge. Is there a problem here? Emma hesitated, her eyes flickering to Jaylen before she forced a smile. There's no problem, Mr. Carter. Just some routine checks that need to be done. David's gaze didn't waver. Then why was my CEO, Jaylen Harris, being denied service in his own bank? The question hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Jaylen's heart beat louder now. This was the moment. This was the turning point. Everything that had happened in the past few minutes, all the small slights, the racial bias, was coming to light, and now it would be addressed. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but David cut her off, his voice growing colder. Don't lie to me, Emma, he said. I'm not interested in your excuses. You and I both know what happened here. A brief silence followed. The weight of his words settled on everyone in the room. Ethan stood still, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of doubt, perhaps even guilt. He had known what was happening. He had seen it unfold. And now he was caught in the middle of it. David turned to him. Ethan, why don't you tell me what happened? He asked, his voice laced with quiet authority. Ethan hesitated, his eyes shifting between David and Jaylen. He was trapped in this moment, knowing that speaking the truth could cost him his job, but staying silent meant betraying everything he had ever believed in. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. I was asked to escort Mr. Harris out of the bank, Ethan said, his voice filled with reluctance. Emma, she said that he was causing a disturbance, but I didn't agree with it. I wasn't comfortable with what was happening. David nodded slowly, processing the information. He then turned back to Emma, his expression hardening. You're fired. Emma, he said without hesitation, effective immediately. Emma's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had always been the one in control, the one making decisions. But now, her power had been stripped away in an instant. Fired, she whispered, her voice faltering. You can't do that. I was just following protocol. David's eyes were cold. You were following your own biases. Emma, you were following a system that doesn't work. A system that hurts people like Jaylen every single day. And I won't tolerate it in my bank. The finality in David's voice was unmistakable. There was no room for negotiation, no place for excuses. Emma's career at the bank was over. The room was silent for a long moment. The employees, the customers, the security, everyone watched as Emma stood there, stunned, her career unraveling in front of her. Finally, she turned and walked toward the back office. Her shoulders slumped, her head down. She knew there was no point in arguing anymore. David turned to Ethan. You're being reassigned. Effective immediately, he said. We don't need people like you here anymore. Ethan's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and guilt, but there was no denying it. His actions had been complicit. He hadn't done enough to stop it. Then David turned to Jaylen, his expression softening. I'm sorry this happened, he said quietly. This shouldn't have been the way you were treated. Jaylen looked at him, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. But now, it felt more like a fire that had been contained. He nodded. Thank you. David glanced at the tellers and other employees in the room. You're all to undergo bias training. Mandatory, he said, his voice firm. This behavior will never be tolerated again. With that, David turned to Jaylen. Let's finish this, he said. You've earned this money, and you're going to walk out of here with it. Jaylen took a deep breath, his anger subsiding just enough to give way to a sense of calm. As he walked to the counter, the employees stepped aside. They were no longer questioning him. They were no longer in control. The money was counted out in neat stacks, placed carefully in front of him. As Jaylen collected his withdrawal, he glanced over at Jamal, the security guard who had been standing by, watching the entire scene unfold. Jamal had been one of the few people who had quietly supported him through this ordeal. And now, as Jaylen locked eyes with him, he smiled. Take the day off, Jaylen said quietly, sliding one of the stacks of cash toward him. Jamal hesitated, his eyes widening in surprise. But Jaylen nodded once, and Jamal took the cash, his fingers curling around it with a sense of gratitude. Jaylen turned, his footsteps sure as he walked toward the door. As he left Peak Ventures Bank for the last time, he glanced over his shoulder and met Victoria's gaze. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes spoke volumes. Should have checked my ID, Jaylen muttered under his breath. And with that, he walked out into the sunlight, the weight of the battle behind him, but the victory still within his grasp. Moral of the story. The lesson from Jaylen Harris's experience is clear. No matter how much we accomplish or how much we earn, we must never forget the invisible biases that can undermine our success. It's easy to think that hard work and achievement will guarantee respect, but sometimes we are still judged by the color of our skin or other prejudices. However, in those moments, it's important to stand firm, to fight for what's right, and to ensure that the systems that perpetuate discrimination are held accountable. In the end, the truth will always come to light, and justice will prevail.